Hello everyone. I'm joined today by Phineas Harper, who is Director of Open City. And you are fairly new to the job. And so could you set out exactly where you've been, how your sort of career's panned out over the last few years, and what's taken you from architecture into where you are now?
Okay, I'm a sort of failed architect, I guess. I studied architecture once upon a time, and then ran away to become a journalist. Ended up as an editor at the Architecture Review. Then ran away from that to the Architecture Foundation. Became more of a kind of events creator, filmmaker, sort of provocateur to some extent. And then last year I curated the Oslo Architecture Triennale, or co-curated the Oslo Architecture Triennale, which was yet another kind of new skill set and adventure. And then finally have ended up here at Open House, which is a kind of extraordinarily weird time to start any job. But I think a particularly weird thing to do is to come in at the director level during a lockdown of a charity that is entirely based around running large events with thousands of people in the middle of the lockdown. To run an organization that's all about opening things is an enormous and very bizarre challenge. But, at least it's interesting. It's quite an exciting thing to do. Some of my friends who are kind of, I don't know, lawyers or something to some extent their job has continued as normal. They just have to do it from their bedroom. Whereas I feel like the challenges that we're taking on at Open House and Open City of trying to kind of keep a spirit of openness alive and kicking in a city that is like locking down around them. It's a really interesting challenge. It's a fucking hard one, but it's a privilege in a way to like have something meaningful to tackle during this time. I think a lot of people are struggling with feeling a sense of kind of the scale of the pandemic and the awfulness of it all does not align with their job, whatever it is, and yet somehow maybe we're lucky that we have the opportunity to make a meaningful contribution. We think we do anyway.
So for anyone who doesn't know what Open City and Open House actually do, can you just explain a little bit what the whole sort of premise of it is and how it operates?
Yeah, Open City is a global network of organizations that put on events about architecture and the built environment for the general public. We like architects, we like built environment professionals, but really our kind of key audience is the general public, like the everyman, the Joe Bloggs, the somebody who's not necessarily an expert, maybe has an interest or is a bit of a nerd, but is not from that career path. And there's 46 open house festivals all around the world, each of which stages this sort of usually annual celebration where they persuade hundreds of buildings to open their doors for one weekend only. And for that weekend, anybody can rock up and have a look around these buildings and go on tours and attend events like discussing or exploring this architecture. That's the kind of core of it. Alongside that, alongside running these huge festivals, we have a year-round program of much smaller events like tours, cycling tours. We publish books. We do a lot of education projects, particularly education work trying to bring design and architecture into schools in kind of deprived areas or where people from underrepresented backgrounds are. And I guess I think that's it. I think in the future we want to be doing more advocacy, policy work, sort of almost opening a kind of think tank wing. Because my frustration with Open House is that it's massive. Like in London alone, you're talking about 250,000 people in a single weekend going around 800 buildings. Internationally, once you wrap in all 46 of our sister organizations, you're talking about 2 million visits taking place in a year to buildings. It is the sort of scale of it is slightly mind-boggling, but maybe what we haven't done in the past that we should do is leverage that platform as much as, are all those visits turning into meaningful and challenging conversations about the future of the city, or how a built environment is procured and made and changed, and for whom and by whom. Sometimes, yeah, absolutely, but I think a lot of the time we focus on just sort of getting people into these buildings, but we don't always think about the quality or the kind of rigorousness of the conversations that they have when they're there. So we've maybe focused on quantity rather than quality. So it is very big, but maybe the challenge is like to have big conversations as well as just being big.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the sort of engagement of the public, the general public, with architecture, because I think your Open City and Open House are one of the sort of only organisations that really engages with the actual public rather than the profession and just general interest groups.
Yeah.
And I think one of the most fascinating things for me is seeing, and I'm sure you've got more insight into the data on this, is seeing which buildings the public want to go to the most, which are the most oversubscribed, where are the big queues, like I think it was Battersea Power Station had a massive queue outside of it and all these different ones. And I suppose that gives you almost a direct feedback into which buildings the public care about the most, or are the most interested in, at least, enough to go and actually see them.
Yeah, I mean, it varies a lot, and I think there are some surprises. I'm very new, so I don't know, exactly what the landscape is. But I think it's very hard to have good conversations about architecture with a general audience. I struggled to do that when I was at the Architecture Foundation. I struggled to do that when I was curating the Oslo Triennale. As people who've studied architecture, we come with a load of baggage, we come with a load of references, we come with like a vocabulary which is not always the most accessible to a broad audience. What Open House does very well is to bring in lots of normal people who don't necessarily have any expertise at all, but who have an interest in the gherkin because they've seen it on the skyline every day for the last 10 years or whatever, or Battersea Power Station because they're getting on a bit and they remember it when it was just this sort of derelict thing in the middle of nowhere, and now they're seeing it turn into the center of a new development. And in a sense, the buildings that are popular are the buildings you would expect, right? They're the iconic, the glitzy, the glamorous, the ones that make it into the news. That's fine, but the challenge is, how do you take someone further? Like maybe they've come to Open House just because they've always fancied getting inside the cheese grater. We as curators could just leave it there. Like maybe our job is just to enable people to access some spaces that they've always wanted to get into but never been able to. That's fine. That's a good thing in itself. But I think the bigger question is, if someone is traveling across the country, potentially the world, to come and see these buildings at this one time, you've got a unique opportunity to have a conversation with them about a bigger idea of urbanism or the future of the city. And those are the kind of conversations that I want to try and be having with people at Open House in the future.
Now, how do you think you're going to be able to do that? Is there sort of a way of engaging visitors to buildings in conversations via apps or while they're there, and also is that the kind of thing that people will engage with, or are they, like you say, literally there because they want to see inside some building that they can't normally get into?
Well, you just got to be sneaky, haven't you? Like it's sort of this is the trick of any kind of curation, is to have something amazing for somebody at whatever level they are prepared to engage with it. So I think this is true of all art, right? Like, the best art works at a very, very surface, shallow, you know nothing about the context, nothing about the artist, and it still moves you in some way. But then it has many, many more layers, and the deeper you dig, the more you will get from that art. So if you think about a really great film, right? it could be like The Matrix, right? Incredible film. Like, you can just watch it as like a great thriller, and you like the special effects, and you know Keanu Reeves is hot or whatever. Like, it works at that very sort of surface level, or it kind of gives you loads of kind of complex metaphysical sort of Descartesian ideas of like, how do I know I exist, and you know, what is reality anyway, and it kind of keeps going as far as you want. And I think the same is true of fine art. If you walk into a room with a Monet painting, it knocks you off your feet. You don't have to know who Monet was. You don't need to know about the process. You don't need to know about like the context in which Monet was painting, or how he like approached the canvas or whatever. It still knocks you off your feet. But if you do want to do the digging and like do some research, there's a whole other there's a really deep pool of knowledge there as well that will reveal so much more. And I think architecture is exactly the same. That like the best architecture takes your breath away without you needing to be an expert in it. But the more you study it, the more you can get from it. And so I guess our job is to help people to go like one step deeper at whatever stage of their journey into this crazy sort of economic, artistic, social art they're at. That's the doorbell.
Should we take a pause? So unpausing. What were we talking about?
I was talking about
going deeper in the engagement
this
on the level of buildings.
Like, it doesn't matter what level someone comes to something. Our job is to get them to like take one step further down the rabbit hole.
I guess in that you're relying on the buildings that they're visiting having additional levels of depth and not being shallow expressions of architectural creation.
Yeah, but like one of the weird things about buildings is that even a very modest piece of architecture, even like a rear extension, has a lot of thinking that goes into it. Like there's a whole aesthetic conversation, there's a whole economic conversation, there's like material choices. You can see an entire theory or an entire kind of approach to making buildings in a very small piece of architecture. So I think that there's always a deeper step to go, even if the building isn't necessarily, you know, one of the best buildings in the world. There will still be a huge amount that you can get out of it with a bit of study.
Yeah. In terms of sort of the feedback mechanism of people's thoughts and opinions for those ones who do want to engage deeper.
Yeah.
Like how do you envision that working? Like how do we get that conversation between like people in the world of architecture like us and general members of the public who are the ones who have to use these buildings and engage with them on a day-to-day level and therefore probably will visit the buildings? How do you create that sort of feedback loop?
I think there's a few things that we need to do as an industry. One thing is we need to get better at talking. Having spent 5 years at the Architecture Foundation, a huge amount of what we were doing was putting on architects on stage, you know, getting people to do lectures for us or panel debates for us. And again and again, you'd have fascinating, creative people talking in the most obscure and bizarre ways. I saw whole lectures where architects would not look at the audience once because they'd be looking at their own slides and almost having this kind of hermetic conversation with themselves about the detail.
Well, there is this addiction that I think gets ingrained in you in architecture school, that you have to have slides, and if you don't have slides, then you've got nothing to say, and therefore all that people want to do is look at the slides of your great buildings that you've been working on in the last 10 years.
Yeah, I think that's true, that we've actually sort of forgotten why we have slides and like what a slide is doing in the context of a lecture. It's just like a sort of default, like, oh, we must have stuff on the big projector thing, and then you end up talking to the stuff, and it's the worst storytelling I've ever seen in architecture lectures, which is odd because often these people are actually quite charismatic. Like you go for a dinner with them afterwards, or you go for, and you know they're like much more effusive, much more lyrical.
Well, there you go. Organise some talks where you ban slides completely or restrict it to 10 slides.
Yeah, well, that's why Pecha Kucha was a successful format, was just like it introduced a kind of gimmick that forced people to use slides differently. I don't want to fixate on slides in particular, but like the broader point is that we are poor communicators. And I think there's a huge amount of work to be done on the part of the architectural industry to like upskill ourselves. And that's something that Open City can maybe help with. Like I want to run public speaking courses for architects. I want to like train ourselves in how to communicate with a broad general audience, because it's hard. Like it's not hard. We don't get taught particularly well in architecture school how to do it. We certainly don't get taught very well how to do it in normal school. There's people who spend their lives dedicated to learning how to be exceptional communicators, and they go to drama schools or they go to, it's a proper skill, and we need to spend a bit more time honing that skill. I think if we've got better at communicating our subject and why it's cool and why we're excited about it and why we spend so much of our lives on it, not only would it mean that the public had a better understanding of architecture, which would be kind of nice, but it would re-empower architecture in a political and public space. Like the reason that you never see an architect on Question Time, you never see an architect on Newsnight, unless something's gone horribly wrong, and they're like hauling someone in to blame for the Garden Bridge or whatever. The reason is that they're quite dull. Like it's hard. TV producers are out there looking for interesting architects to stick in front of cameras, and they can't.
Yeah, well, Zaha was the last one to get any form of attention, wasn't she? She popped up on Newsnight occasionally.
Yeah, and she did that pretty great Desert Island Discs, in which she picked Hotline Bling as one of her favorite of all time songs. I mean, she was like an amazing celebrity, and like the power of her character transcended her actual skill as a public speaker. But even she was not necessarily like a brilliant communicator. If you stuck her in front of a lectern, she found other ways of communicating. But I just think in general, all of us in architecture, we need to spend a month or two at RADA. We need to get slightly better at commanding attention, like earning airtime.
Yeah, well, I guess we fall into the same trap that lots of sort of academic fields do, which is talking within this sort of little bubble in this weird language that only we speak, that the public can't really understand most of, and equally we wouldn't understand most of the language of anyone else's bubble.
Yeah.
And it does take a skill to not do that. And you think that would link directly back to being a good architect and pitching to clients, because clients aren't architects and wouldn't understand most of the things you're talking about.
Yeah.
One of the things I constantly hear complaining from some of my friends who are either counsellors or planners is that architects constantly come in and start talking about how great their design is and what inspired them, and this thing references that thing, and it's just completely irrelevant to what makes their decision as to whether or not they approve a planning application, for example.
Right.
Which I think links into the communication point.
Yeah. Well, I think you're right. All industries have the same problem in a sense, and having a professional vocabulary is not a bad thing in itself. It's important to be able to communicate ideas quickly within a professional context, but that's not the same as being able to realize when you're not in that context and you have to moderate or change or develop your tone of voice, your body language, the thing is that we're all really good at this. Like if you're talking in a pub to a close friend, you're an extraordinary communicator. Everybody is. We are very good, emotionally literate conveyors of information and feeling. Usually, it's the context of standing up in front of a group of people, school children, a lecture audience, a client group, whatever, a public consultation, that we fall apart in. And a lot of the secret, if there is a secret to public speaking, is to just be more like we are when we're having a heart-to-heart conversation with someone we love and trust with strangers, and less like we're kind of lecturing in, a sort of school teacher doing the Sunday assembly or whatever at a boarding school or whatever.
I think you're right. It can be incredibly dull sometimes. Especially, and it's surprising, like you say, some of the best architects that you had up for some of the Architecture Foundation sort of lectures, you get these huge audiences in the Barbican or wherever it was that you held lots of them. And they do exactly the same thing that every other architect does, which is go in and do the slides thing and not really do a proper storytelling kind of thing. They just explain what it is that they've got in front of them.
Yeah. The other, I said there are two things we need to do. I think the other thing we need to do is fall in love with tours, right? Walking tours, cycling tours, building tours, any kind of tours. Because ultimately, it's really hard to get your head into architecture without experiencing it. The only way really to get it is to see it, to be in it, to explore it. And in a sense, I think that a lot of people get very excited about, a new zine has been launched, great. A new podcast has been launched, great. New film series, great. But actually, like, the really cool architectural media is the walking tour as a format. And I love them. I'm not very good at giving them, but I have such admiration for people who are like great architectural tour guides. I think it's a huge public service, and in my view is far, far more valuable than being like a trendy magazine editor. Even though I think tour guides get a bad rep. They're sort of seen as like the less sexy thing to do. If you're like an up and coming provocateur in architecture, you don't necessarily aspire to be a tour guide. But I think that is that's us kind of copying the fashion world and the graphic design world and like media people. Actually, we should kind of own our own media tactics. And for me, at least, like the coolest and best thing that anybody who aspires to be a kind of journalistic commentator could do is to set up a series of walking tours. And that is something that Open House can help with, because we run tours throughout the year. Obviously, we have this mad festival where we do loads of them in one go, but I think every day, every weekend, there should be architectural tours buzzing around every neighbourhood of London. And in a sense that getting out and exploring the city through tours should be the core of how we as a community think about, interrogate and discuss the future of the city that we live in. It should be like at the heart of architectural culture is tours, and then like everything else, talks, lectures, exhibitions, magazines, whatever, that's on the periphery, or like that's added on, but like at the absolute core is tours.
Yeah, well, I noticed you've got the cycling tours coming up all over London, which I think is an excellent idea. I do envisage like piles of cyclists blocking up roads every 2 minutes when they stop.
Yeah, it'd be like one of those epic ride outs where you have like 400 teenagers all clogging up Tower Bridge with their bikes, except they're all architecture nerds.
Well, if anything, now's a great time to be launching that kind of thing, isn't it? With loads of pop-up cycle lanes being thrown in all over the place and more people moving into cycling as a means of transport.
Yeah, definitely.
So, yeah, and it's... I do find it interesting that you're focusing on, most of your tours focus on modern architecture. And as far as I'm aware, that most of the tour space is occupied by people like the National Trust and all the historical stuff, for which there's obviously a huge audience, probably an older audience, but still a huge audience. So given that architecture is a sort of multi-century thing, unlike other mediums, could that play in to the way that you sort of communicate architecture, that to get across that continuity to people, that, I don't know, here's a social housing scheme from 1960 and here's a social housing scheme from 1860 or something like that, and to sort of to not fall into that trap of staying within the sort of modern architecture obsessed architectural world, and to sort of pick up on that general, more public interest in things that like the National Trust focuses on and the more historical side of things.
Yeah, I think you're dead right. And I think that to some extent, that's one of the cool things about Open House as a festival, is that you do have like a bit of Wren and Hawksmoor sitting comfortably alongside a Norman Foster or a Zaha Hadid, and that's fine. That's like, in fact, it's good. And it does seem to kind of transcend some of the silly schisms between the trad create streets gang and the like 20th century society and Docomomo, or like, I don't know, New London vernacular. We aspire as an organization to value and appreciate all of that, or at least all of what is good within those different movements. And one of Open City's new tours is it starts with the Boundary Estate, really the kind of first bit of social housing in the country, and then heads east through East London, ending up with Balfron Tower and Robin Hood Gardens by Goldfinger and the Smithsons, both of which were, they're post-war social housing, but both of which have endured like quite extraordinary interventions very recently, with most of Robin Hood Gardens being knocked down for regeneration and Balfron Tower being decanted and regenerated. They kept the building, but they've completely changed the tenure. So that tour takes you on a story of British approaches to housing and social housing from its like inception to today. And you move through different styles and movements. In a sense, all of those kind of play back second fiddle to the broader narrative of like what has happened to British housing throughout time, or at least British social public throughout time. So yeah, I think you're dead right. There's a huge amount we can gain from kind of mixing together interest in the historic, the traditional, the classical, with interest in the modern, the contemporary, and hopefully revealing that actually these distinctions are not as useful as sometimes people think they are, and actually it's sort of the ideas or the kind of socio-political stuff that sits behind those aesthetic movements that is more that you can really get your teeth into.
Well, going back to the feedback loop thing, maybe you could get people to give each building a rating out of 10 on every tour, and then keep a running scoreboard as to which buildings are most popular.
Yeah, well, it depends on people. Like, inevitably, people have the most emotional attachment to the things they're most familiar with. What are they most familiar with? The things that they see on tourist postcards the most. Like, it's Big Ben, it's St. Paul's, to some extent it's the Millennium Bridge, which is like featured on the BBC News regularly. Tower Bridge, obviously, sort of icon of London. That's not necessarily because those are sort of outstanding pieces of architecture, and actually if you kind of push people, they will kind of fess up to that. But of course we are, if you ask the general public to pick their like top 5 buildings, they're going to end up picking the things that they've just seen the most on postage stamps, and that's kind of fine. I don't have any objection to like the British public liking Christopher Wren. That's cool. My question is like, how can you take that existing culture or that folk culture and nudge it a bit further? Like, if you're interested in Christopher Wren, let's talk about Wren's plan for London, and let's think about Wren as a town planner, and like that maybe can get you into a conversation about town planning today, which can maybe get you into a conversation about planning policy, which can maybe get you into a conversation about equality or like gentrification. So it's finding the what I hate is when people are sort of snobby and they're like, oh, people like Big Ben, what do they know? They have no taste. a much more interesting way to approach that is to be like, okay, people like Big Ben, how can we do something interesting with that? How can we, take those people by the hand and show them something maybe a bit more cool or a bit more interesting, or that kind of helps them on a journey. It's like if you're, into the Beatles, great, everyone loves the Beatles, but like, into the Beatles, you must like George Harrison. If you like George Harrison, maybe like Ravi Shankar. If you like Ravi Shankar, maybe, that opens up a whole world. But I think too often in architecture, we kind of dismiss people's taste for being too working class or too like lowbrow or too like obvious or something. And I've never really got it. I've never really understood why we do it, because I think we're just shooting ourselves in the foot every time we kind of sneer at people who maybe have different architectural taste to us. We could challenge it by all means, and we could present alternative perspectives, but I don't think we should be in the business of being snobby. But we are often.
Yeah, well, I guess that's something we've inherited from the other creative industries, that there's this sort of institutional idea of what good taste is and doesn't necessarily correlate with what ordinary people prefer. But I guess your challenge from the sort of presenting this stuff in tours especially is to find people who have sufficient historical knowledge of a sufficiently broad range of buildings and their histories and things and their influences and are of course engaging tour guides to give people a great experience of London or wherever else it is. It doesn't necessarily have to just be London, of course. Yeah,
well, we have there's 46 open house organisations. It might be 47 by the end of this conversation. Taipei wants to join, which is great. But yeah, it's really hard. It's really hard to do a great. It's hard to do a great talk about architecture. It's even harder to do a great tour, which you have to move and talk, and there's logistics and gather around. It's a real skill, and I want to use this opportunity that I've been kind of given running this organization to train people, to train a new generation of tour guides, to upskill the whole industry in its ability to communicate engagingly about what we do, share why we are excited to work in the field that we do, and that's an enormous privilege to kind of be given that opportunity.
And I have to ask you about climate stuff, because I know this is a particular interest of yours and indeed of all of ours these days. What do you think the architectural profession needs to do to make more progress more quickly on climate-related matters, to the extent, whatever that is, that it can?
We need to do a lot of things. No one industry contributes as much to global warming as construction. It's just mind-boggling how the combination of making buildings and running buildings is just an enormous piece of the puzzle. And architecture is maybe it's not the biggest chunk of construction, but we do have some power and agency, and we certainly have the power to show alternative ways of doing things. So in terms of what the architecture industry needs to do differently, I think part of it relates to what we've already discussed, this idea that we need to be better communicators. We need to be able to galvanize the public and political imagination around the idea of low carbon architecture. That is a hard thing to do. Low carbon architecture is not an inherently sexy subject. It doesn't look like our traditional visions of the future. It doesn't involve flying cars and glittering kilometer-high towers and mining asteroids. It's a those kind of visions, the sort of like 50s and 60s visions of the future, are very seductive. They were communicated extraordinarily well by the artists who drew pictures for the fronts of science fiction novels or for filmmakers. And we have an enormous amount of work to do to show an equally, if not more seductive alternative that is based around living within planetary limits. I think that if architects were better communicators in all senses, we would be more prepared, more able to persuade policymakers or the general public or the media that there were good, meaningful, realistic, seductive alternatives to high carbon culture. So part of it is communication. Another part of it is like taking a long, hard look at ourselves in the mirror and falling out of love with some of our aesthetic preferences and some of the kind of mantras that we use to tell ourselves what is good architecture. So there are certain materials that are just really high carbon, and it's very hard to build anything out of these materials that has a meaningful role to play in a low carbon economy.
Which are the worst culprits?
Well, concrete is obviously gigantic. A lot of metals and alloys have huge energy costs, which means huge carbon costs. Depending on how you make it, brick can be a real bad one, like very, very high energy, not particularly strong as a material. And I think there's a role for architecture to play in finding the sexiness in low carbon materials, because we've spent decades, centuries building up an extraordinarily lush vocabulary and culture around a set of materials. Like the things you can do with concrete nowadays are magical. Like it can be a spectacular, moving, visceral experience in the hands of the right architect. When you walk into a concrete building, if it's been designed extraordinarily well, it can do that Monet thing. It can knock you off your feet. And the same is true of bricks. That's not happened overnight. We've spent a long time as an industry nurturing and developing ways of working with materials that can have that kind of visceral, powerful architectural effect. And we are nowhere near the same amount of sophistication and kind of cultural development with low carbon materials. So hemp, straw bales, unfired clay, thatch, just using wood, wood that hasn't been seasoned in a kiln. There's an enormous aesthetic opportunity for architects to discover ways of working with low carbon materials that it's just sitting there. It's like waiting for somebody to seize it and do extraordinary things with. But it's gonna. We haven't really got enough time. Like we don't have centuries to do this in. We have to very rapidly invent new kind of cultural paradigms based around materials that have been there for a long time. And if I was still in architecture, that would be the thing that was exciting me. It would be like being at the start of modernism to some extent, and like these amazing new materials that have come onto the market, steel and reinforced concrete, and like suddenly the world has changed because you have the opportunity to make things out of these new materials that have never been made before. We're at a similar moment where the rules of the game have changed, and things that were sort of the received wisdom of our parents' generation has just vanished, and suddenly there's a new set of tools, and they're like grass and mud and hemp and wood, and the opportunity is to do what the modernists did with steel and concrete, but with low carbon materials. And that's pretty cool. What a like privilege to live at a time where we have been given this enormous responsibility to tear up the rule book and do something that would have been considered inconceivable even 3 years ago.
Well, let me play the devil's advocate role of the big developer client who comes along and says, I want to build a skyscraper, or I want to build a large, great big 1,000-unit development, and you're telling me I have to build it out of hemp and straw and grass and
wood. Yeah.
How are you going to persuade that person, both financially and, I guess, in terms of their corporate responsibility policy, that they should spend more money and therefore make less profit on their development?
I don't have to persuade them because they're persuading themselves. Most of the big developers are already ahead of architects in their long-term planning for shifting to climate-friendly policies. Now, a whole load of big developers have said they're going carbon neutral by 2030. That is a more ambitious target than our own government.
But again, is that them saying, we're going to go carbon neutral, but we're not going to do it by using structural timber, for example. We're going to do it by continuing to build concrete and then planting 10,000 trees in some country somewhere?
Yeah, some of them. But I think a lot of the big developers, particularly the really big ones, or the ones that are funded by, I don't know, like pension funds who have a kind of 200-year investment plan.
The real estate investment trusts.
They're not Trump. They're not climate change deniers. They understand that this is real. They understand that they need to do something about it. They understand that the materials that they're using and the practices they're using will become illegal at some point in the future. They don't know when it's going to happen. They don't know, is it going to be like imposed on them, or is it, they don't know the exact mechanisms that are going to like kick in to force their hand, but they know that it's coming. And so they are thinking already about how do you build in a low carbon way. And I think they've got a long way to go, but I don't think things are as bleak as sometimes people assume. We are not surrounded by climate change deniers who just want to kind of continue business as usual. I think, are surrounded by people who their definition of good business is long-term sustainability. And long-term sustainability means ecological sustainability, and it means politically viable practices. And what is viable is going to change. So I don't really think the challenge is the developers necessarily. Like, obviously there's some weird stuff going on with wood at the moment, and there's certain lobbyists who are campaigning very hard to stop structural timber from becoming popular. That's not because they that's just because they want to kind of squeeze as much concrete frame construction out as possible before it kind of goes off the market entirely. But they're going to lose that battle. It's just a matter of when, of when the transition comes.
So you've successfully persuaded all the major developers. How do you persuade the architects who've grown up idolizing their icons of Corbusier and Aalto and Mies and all of the great modernists who used glass and concrete and steel and
This is in a sense the trickier question. Is like I've certainly been taught to love the Farnsworth House by Mies, and there's something very sexy about these like huge sheets of glass and this like spindly steel frame. And I now realize that I've been a little bit brainwashed and like have to learn to unlove some of that stuff. It's a little bit like you've spent too much time looking at models in like fashion mags or something, and now you've got a like slightly warped idea of what bodies look like, and your beauty standards have been kind of fucked around with by the contemporary media, and you have some work to do to kind of like realize to yourself that some of these glossy pin-ups are not actually what real beauty is, or what real beauty should be. And the way I would try and persuade an architect to maybe kind of turn their back on the Miesian dream, I think there's a number of ways you can do it. One way is to talk about truth to performance of materials, because we have this existing aesthetic vocabulary about truth to materials, and that seems to be very appealing to a lot of architects, that like they don't like a concealed steel lintel because it's somehow like cheating to not use bricks in the way that bricks are meant to be used as load-bearing arches. Well, you could apply that same logic to the Farnsworth House and say, why are these incredibly high-performance steel members being used to create this like one-story high villa? This is a ridiculous abuse of truth to the performance of materials. If you're going to use a high-carbon, high-performance material like steel, fine, but like use it in a way where it's like used to its maximum capacity. And I think that there could be a new aesthetic vocabulary, or a new aesthetic paradigm that we build up around performance, and insisting that high carbon materials are fine as long as they are like really worth it in the building. We're still going to build with concrete, but we're only going to use it when it's like doing the absolute most it can do. Another way to do it is simply about creativity and saying, why are you still kind of faffing around with this Miesian aesthetic that was designed in a completely different ecological era, when you have the opportunity to like be your own person, stand on your own 2 feet, like make your own moves in the world? Why are you so afraid of change? Why are you so worried about the avant-garde? And that's a very persuasive narrative as well, because a lot of architects really want to be avant-garde. They really like the idea of being new and cutting edge, and like no one's ever done this before, and we have a real obsession with newness. Well, maybe we could kind of channel that obsession into material culture and say, okay, if you prove it. If you're so avant-garde, if you're so creative, if you're like nothing that ever came before, if you're not just rehashing old ideas, then show me what the future of architecture looks like. Your material palette is low carbon materials, but like other than that, there are no constraints. Go. And I feel like they're both quite seductive messages. The truth to materials thing and the let's be avant-garde thing both appeal to a sense of like competitive creativity, that we want to, as artistic practitioners, do something amazing. And if we can redefine high carbon materials as not amazing, or as like could do better, then people will they will move away from them on their own, because they will want to be seen as cool and amazing, rather than like boring, trad, old hat, another boring concrete building, great.
Well, maybe the trads will be the people who are copying the buildings from the 20s and 30s rather than the pre-Victorian era and before.
I think we're already getting there to some extent. Sometimes people are using concrete because they can't imagine anything else, and that's a symptom of not being very creative, or like not thinking.
Well, to take a segue from that, could it be a symptom of education, architectural education, to any degree? And if so, where does the fault lie, and how is it rectified?
Can I pause for a second to get some more Prosecco?
Absolutely.
I'm also going to get some Frau Better. Do you want some more?
A tiny splash. So to segue from what we were talking about into, could it be that that's the fault lies in education, that people are being taught things in one way or another that aren't sustainable or aren't progressive enough in terms of the way that architecture needs to go to solve the issues in climate and general sustainability?
I think architectural education is extraordinary, and I have sort of taken a vow to be very, very positive about architectural education, because I think it's very popular at the moment, maybe it has been forever, to slag off architectural education, to bash tutors, to bash schools, to bash students. And I completely understand where that comes from, right? I've been to architecture school. Like, I know its weaknesses. I know where it could be better. But I think that architectural education is incredibly precious, does a lot of things right, and is under attack from all sides. And if we're not careful, we will lose this thing. If I compare architectural education, so we're talking about like university level education, to other courses, you study psychology at university, you're paying like $9,000 a year if you're in the UK, more often if you're a foreign student or other institutions. You maybe get like 8 hours of contact time a week, most of which is lectures with hundreds of other people, literally like this sort of like production line of almost no meaningful interaction, maybe like a seminar with 6 other people and a PhD student, and then pretty much the rest of your experience is the library and a big pile of books. Architectural education involves a studio. It involves workshops. You make things with your hands. You make things with your computer. You go on study trips. You go on site visits. You have weekly one-to-one tutorials, usually, depending on your school. You also have these crits, and people give crits a hard time, but ultimately crits, leading figures in the industry come and talk to you in depth about your project one-to-one, and often more than one-to-one. Like, you sort of have 5 people talking to one student about their work. I once saw a crit where the student had studied Kate McIntosh, the seminal post-war housing architect, and she'd done this, this was her kind of master's level 5th year project about Dawson's Heights, which is a housing estate that Kate designed when she was 26 in South London. And the project was this very interesting kind of extrapolation of Dawson's Heights. Who turns up to crit for her? Kate McIntosh turns up. So this woman that she's been studying for her entire year comes in person to talk to her about her project. It was like, you'd never get, if you're studying Chomsky doesn't come and talk to you about...
Shakespeare turns up to analyze your analysis.
Okay. Death maybe is a barrier, but like, other than death, it's incredible how in architectural culture, and architectural education is a big part of our culture, we have such a rich education that involves so many different types of experience as a student. And yeah, it's tough, and yeah, there's problems with crits, and yeah, like, the wider context of British higher education stinks, and like there's real political problems there. And there's probably a lot that could be done in terms of expanding the architectural syllabus. Particularly, I'm thinking around decolonization and like a wider sense of who we're celebrating in the canon. There's certainly a lot we could do around carbon and like making sure that all students are graduating with a very sophisticated knowledge of how to design in a post-carbon economy. But ultimately, I think architectural education is fucking great. And I think people who bitch about it are diverting attention from the real problem, which is practice. Like, if we are not going to solve the climate emergency by training first years how to design low carbon buildings, because by the time those first years have graduated, developed through their career and become practice directors at the age of 50 or 60, it's going to be too late. So the change has to come in practice. And although I think there are things we could do to improve architectural education, ultimately the focus has to be kept in like the professional world.
Yeah, I think I agree with that, because you're right, it's the practice directors who are making the decisions day to day, isn't it? Like, no matter how sort of principled and all great, amazing things you are when you graduate, if you're then doing door schedules for 5 years and not making any design decisions or material decisions, you're not going to have that influence that we need directors to have, really.
Yeah. The same is true in race, by the way. So a lot of people say, okay, the reason there's architecture is a largely white industry, maybe it's got something to do with it's not attractive enough to people from diverse backgrounds, and architectural schools need to do more to widen access to people from underrepresented backgrounds. Maybe that's true to some extent, sure. But actually, if you look at the Millennium Cohort Study, which is something that the LSE does every year, they study every 10 years, I think, they study a whole group of people. The only group in society who rate architect as one of the like top 3 things they want to be when they grow up are black women, or black girls specifically. Like, everyone else wants to be a footballer or a lawyer or a pop star, film star, whatever. Black girls want to do those things, but they also want to be architect. I think it's number 2 most popular career aspiration, right? How weird then that actually in the world of professional architecture there are loads of black women in architecture, but like very few at the top, very few practice directors, very few prominent black female architects, right? I would say the problem is not that it's young people who aren't interested. Young people clearly are interested, and the RIBA surveys incoming students every year, and their research is also quite clear that, like, if you look at the people coming into architecture school, it's extremely diverse. People coming out the other end and into part 3, not so diverse. People rising up the career ladder and becoming directors or having that power that you're talking about to make actual decisions, even less diverse. So what that tells me is that the problems they're not in the undergrad. They're not like people coming in on day one. It kicks in as you start doing your part 1 placement, as you do your part 2 placement, as you go through part 3. Those are the points where we're seeing the kind of racial diversity in architecture kind of evaporate. So yeah, again, it's like, yes, schools do need to do widening access stuff. Yes, they need to support people from underrepresented backgrounds more while they're in school. But actually, again, practice is the kind of place where I'd put the biggest burden of responsibility, and I would defend architectural education in general, because I think if we don't, we're going to lose it. It's going to get cut.
Do you think the apprenticeship scheme as an alternative route has a role to play in that regard, or is it sort of a dead end in terms of it might work for a tiny minority of people, but it's not really going to have that much effect?
I don't know enough to answer that question properly, really. I don't know enough about the apprenticeship scheme. I think that alternative routes are brilliant and we should have more of them, just in general. And I'm probably leaning towards the scrap the title of architect entirely camp.
Really?
But I kind of go back and forth on all of this.
There'll be a lot of professionals who are very interested in keeping their protected title.
I just don't. I think
gatekeeping.
It's a political reality thing. In a world where you have protection of title and protection of role, great, keep protection of title because it means something. In our world, in Britain, where you don't have protection of role, where all you're really protecting is a sort of brand, I don't think it's worth it. I think we've got a choice. Either we really fight for protection of role to get that back, to get like they have in America or France, or we give up entirely and we say, let 1,000 flowers bloom, let's deregulate protection of role, protection of title, and make the threshold to make the conversation about being a good designer of buildings rather than have you gone through this series of checks with the RIBA?
I suppose you'd probably end up with just a different substitution like you have with engineers, where they just call themselves chartered engineers.
Yeah, that might be a sort of interim
Also, did they have protection of
Solution.
function in the US?
Yeah, in the US, if you want to build a building above a certain size, you need an architect to sign off on it.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay, I didn't know that.
They have. I wouldn't hold the US up as a gleaming example of good architecture. That's for other reasons, I think. But architects in the US have a lot more power in some senses than in the UK, because they can. If all the architects in the US said we're not going to work on prisons, you wouldn't be able to build a prison in America.
Well, that you've hinted on the interesting moral dilemma, which seems to come up increasingly more often, of should architects accept jobs on certain types of building. Whether I think the latest one was Foster's new super private, super luxury airport that looks like some spiky aloe vera plant or something settled in the desert.
Yeah, well, workers in general have been thinking about what to boycott forever, right? And they've been organizing as communities of people with a skill or a trade to affect change in the world. And one of the earliest examples is the Tolpuddle Martyrs, who got together and they said, we're all getting shafted on this agricultural work. Let's agree to not lower our fees as labourers below a certain point. And they were all deported to Australia because the British state was so terrified of organised workers that it felt it had to criminalise and deport these people for doing it. But ultimately, that protest, or that kind of little bit of proto-unionisation laid the groundwork for what is contemporary labour law. And there was a petition of over 100,000 signatures at a time hundreds of years ago. Someone managed to get 100,000 signatures and delivered it to Parliament. And many years later, you have the Trade Union Act, which allows workers to organise properly and to form organising bodies and to collectively campaign for change, whether that's change to their conditions as workers or wider change. And the reason we have weekends is because trade unions campaigned for them. The reason that we have an 8-hour working day rather than a 12-hour working day is because trade unions organised and campaigned for it. I would argue that one of the reasons that South Africa ultimately gave up on apartheid was organised workers around the world created strikes, created boycotts, and put pressure on the South African government. And it's not new in most industries for workers to think critically about the work that they take on and the power that they have as workers. Architects feel like it is new, like it is weird, because we've never really done it. We've never really, because we've our industry has come from privilege. Architecture was once this sort of gentleman's profession that only the very rich did. It hasn't come from working class people selling their labor in order to live. I'd argue that we are now a working class profession. People aren't architects for fun, really. Most architects need to sell their labor in order to survive. And if you're in that position, you're not part of the aristocracy. You're part of normal working people. And we ought to realize that means we no longer are in this. We no longer can think of ourselves as somehow removed from the ethical dilemmas of how we do or don't use our labor in the world. We are in the same melee as any other kind of worker, and we ought to be thinking critically about our labor. And the question of whether or not we should be taking on private airports or solitary confinement facilities or execution facilities, for me, is a very simple one. We shouldn't. Like, we should have the intellectual, ethical, and professional integrity to resist taking on those kind of jobs. And I think we probably could get there, but the sort of step before we can do that is we have to sort of understand ourselves as workers, to understand that we have more power together as an organized community than we do apart as individual authors or as individual artists. And maybe that's the kind of division, that's the kind of jump we need to make, is to think of ourselves more as like a class of worker than as these kind of great stars who can, accomplish wonderful things as individuals.
Yeah, it's an interesting distinction.
Kiefer Dunn, is it Kiefer Dunn? From the architecture lobby in America, which is trying to kind of become a kind of almost like a trade union for architects. He argues that, like, as an architect, the site of your power is not your work. It's the fact that you're a worker. Like, you can't really affect change through design. That's a silly aspiration. Like, maybe you can do some tiny little adjustments, like make it slightly easier for neighbors to hang out, or you can inch us closer to better ecological construction. But really, your primary power as an individual is as an employee and as a worker and as a part of a wider body of workers. So I'm very excited by the possibilities of what could be possible, about what we could do together if we worked together, rather than this sort of contemporary situation where we just endlessly compete.
That's interesting to hear that perspective, because I've always thought that going almost the other way is where the influence lies, that almost retaking back the role of the master builder and being the instigators of projects rather than merely consultants to developers. Because the counter argument, or the most obvious counter argument to a boycott on any particular program, is that someone will do it. If you don't have a protection of function, then there'll always be someone who'll be willing to either sell out and do it, or not follow the boycott, or there'll be someone who isn't an architect who'll do it, and therefore you end up with, you're going to have the product, the building created one way or another. Is it better that it's done well by a competent architect than by someone who's maybe a less competent architect? So it's sort of an ends to means thing. And maybe that program, maybe that airport might not always be an airport for the rich, and maybe one day it'll become a shelter for people, or maybe it'll become a sports venue or something like that. So that to me is the most obvious counter argument. And I don't know how you resolve that. But yeah, I think it's interesting to see architects as workers.
It's not a binary. I think that there are lots of examples from history where boycotts have been effective, and apartheid is the most obvious one, that there was a kind of international boycott of the South African government because they were a racist government, and that ultimately was part, if not all, but it contributed to the fall of that government and the end of apartheid. But you don't have to be as successful as that to still have had an impact. I think veganism is fascinating. Clearly veganism has not ended the meat industry, but more and more people become vegans every day. It's the fastest growing diet in the world. And it's created a huge market for far lower carbon ways of life and food production and so on. But veganism is effectively a boycott. It's about what you're not consuming rather than what you are consuming. It's sort of saying, I'm not going to eat meat, I'm not going to eat dairy. But enough people, veganism is still a tiny minority of people, but enough people are doing it now that it has an effect. And so it's not, from the point of view of the meat industry, all right, someone else will eat that hamburger. But actually, over time, there's fewer and fewer of those someone else's will eat that hamburger, and it is having an impact. Like you don't have to eliminate, you don't have to get rid of all meat eaters to still have hugely contributed to reducing the carbon emissions associated with the meat industry through growing the vegan community. I'm not actually a vegan myself, but I think it's a very I've never seen, other than the COVID-19 transition, like how fast we shifted to a completely different lifestyle. Other than that, I've never seen such a fast transition away from like something so kind of culturally ingrained as eating meat every day to veganism as we've had over the last sort of 5-6 years.
But do you think that's possible to have that same kind of effect on the sort of, I don't know, geopolitics of things just by refusing to not design particular kinds of buildings?
Yeah, if enough people do it. This is what it is. It's like, me on my own, I have no power. I could refuse to design your airport. Who cares? Us as a community, us as a class of worker, we have power. And we're so willing to kind of, we have no sense of solidarity. This is the kind of key word. We're not prepared to suffer as a community. So we instantly go like, oh, if he's not going to take that airport on, I will. Because if I don't, someone else will. Whereas if we had a better sense of solidarity, we would be like, he's not taking that airport on, so I won't either, because we're in this together, and like our futures and our fates as businesses, as humans, as citizens of the planet are one fate. And like if I take the job on that he won't take on, I have like stabbed him in the back, and not only him, but like myself and like our planet and our profession.
Well, what if, to sort of carry it on, because first of all, the thing that strikes me is I'm not sure that our profession, or indeed almost any profession, is sufficiently homogenous to sort of be of one mindset on any particular issue. But the other thing that you could say is maybe I will take that airport on, but I'm going to persuade the client to use structural timber instead of concrete, to plant loads of, the immediate one that comes to mind is the Forest Green Rovers Stadium, Zaha Timber Football Stadium. I'm going to use sustainable materials.
Alberta, can you get that?
I'm going to, plant those trees around the site, make it really ecological, increase the biodiversity of the area, which maybe were things that the client wouldn't have done otherwise. And maybe I'm going to encourage them to build a load of houses for local workers, or improve their site conditions, or make sure they're treating the migrant workers on site within certain limits. And maybe the influence in there is if I sort of facilitate change from the inside rather than trying to do it from the outside. And that's the sort of the opposite philosophy, but I'm not sure which one would be more effective.
Well, it's not working at the moment, is it? Like that is the argument that a lot of the kinds of practices who take on massive aviation projects make is like by being part of by being at the table, we're able to nudge it in a more ethical or ecological direction. But like we're still in a context where migrant workers are dying on construction sites all over the world on projects that are led by glamorous international architects. We're still in a context where the aviation industry is one of the biggest polluters on the planet, facilitated by international architects in very big offices. So your argument would be more convincing if we could point to some like very good examples, but aviation is not new, and neither is ecological architecture, and yet it's still very hard to see any proof of this being at the table strategy working, of a carbon negative airport. That's because of science, right? That's because there are physical limits to the kinds of things we can do in a low carbon way. It's no one's fault necessarily that you can't fly a jumbo jet around the world in like half an hour and not expend any carbon. It's just like the nature of living on the planet in the way that we do. And I'm very comfortable with that. Like my kind of version of modernist, rationalist, scientific understanding of the world is that constraints are cool. Constraints are part of what makes living in this body on this planet interesting. If we were kind of all-powerful super beings and we just typed in the cheat code to The Sims, that version of life gets boring quite quickly. And that's why, as soon as you end up using the cheat code in The Sims, you sort of stop in a few days because it's just like the game has evaporated. And I just feel like if we think of ourselves as truly creative people, then we have to embrace constraints and see them not as things that hold us back, but the things that define our creativity. And that it's so much more interesting to work within constraints than without them. And one of those constraints is clearly that, for the time being, no one's figured out how to make a low carbon plane, and therefore we really oughtn't to have anything to do with enabling high carbon aviation.
Yeah, fair enough.
Let's if we think we're creative people, let's use that creativity well. It's the whole Spider-Man thing. It's like if you have great power
comes great responsibility.
Yeah. And imagine if all the amazing energy, and I don't doubt the creativity of the practices who take on these projects for a second, they're all extraordinary, but imagine if that creativity was going into solving the housing crisis, or imagine if that was going into like redefining the relationship with agriculture and urbanism, or fixing transport.
I'm trying to imagine a Foster and Partners Barratt Homes estate now.
I reckon it'd be pretty good. Like the ultimately.
Yeah, why isn't Foster and Partners doing Barratt Homes estates?
The reason Barratt Homes estates are not great is, well, actually, they could, let's say, they could benefit from some design, some serious design skill.
Yeah.
And,
well, that's the argument for protection of function, isn't it?
Which I support, but not wrong.
I'm on the fence. I'll do another 10 minutes if that's all right.
Sure.
The last thing I wanted to ask you about is architecture and water.
Oh, okay.
Not least because, am I right in thinking you live on a canal boat?
I own a canal boat, which at the moment there's a guy called Dave who lives on it. But I lived on it for 5.5 years.
Oh, wow.
I'm living in a housing cooperative at the moment, but I do still have the boat.
Okay. And this is, I guess, going from the global to the local, especially in London. It's always struck me how disconnected London is from its waterways, especially the Thames. I'm a kayaker and canoeist. I spend a lot of time on rivers and canals and stuff. How do you think London can reconnect better with its waterways and especially with the Thames?
Yeah, well, I think it's a really big, important question. The Thames is our biggest public space, 8 times bigger than Hyde Park, I think, and yet almost nobody can access it. Like the only way to kind of get on the Thames is to pay quite a lot of money or to own property next to it or something. It's right in the middle of the city. It's huge, it's public, and yet it's also somehow locked. You can just sort of look at it from the side. It wasn't always that way. Once upon a time, the Thames was a more porous place, and people would swim in it. You could go down to its edges. If it froze over, people had these crazy fates where they, market stalls on the frozen Thames. Anyone could get a boat over it. It was a much more living, breathing part of the city. Now it's this sort of weird artery that is sort of half vista. You just sort of look at it, and then it's half kind of tourist opportunity, the sort of leisure activities that happen on it. And even the Thames Clipper, which is the speedy catamarans that go up and down the Thames and are meant to be part of our transport network, they're so expensive that they're effectively just a kind of tourism thing. Like it's a sort of cheap way of getting a boat tour, but people don't really use them as like proper commuting or proper travel. I think there's a lot of barriers that we need to unpick to like get back the Thames. One is clearly to do with perception. People perceive the Thames to be toxic. It's not really. Well,
as someone who's gotten ill from drinking too much Thames water quite regularly, I would
How often do you drink Thames
put a slight caveat on that.
Like the problem with London's sewage system is the stormwater drains drain into the Thames. So if you go swimming in the Thames after it has rained, then you'll be in amongst sewerage. But if it hasn't rained for a while, the Thames is all right. And there's, fish have returned to the Thames, and there's whole bits of it that it's totally kind of, it's not that bad, basically. But there's this very strong perception that, even touching it is dangerous. So I think part of, there's a kind of education project there, like explaining to people why the Thames is, it's not that it's like permanently toxic. It's like at times following rain, because we haven't built the super sewer yet, there are problems with the Thames. It's a bit like going swimming at any beach. Like there are certain times of day when maybe you don't want to go swimming because the tide is particularly strong and it's dangerous. Like we need to have that kind of understanding of like there's just like this is a big natural force, and you don't want to take it lightly, but that doesn't mean that you can't go anywhere near it. There's still ways of engaging with it. Another is political. So the Thames is controlled by the Port of London Authority, who, as far as I know, are an unelected, self-selecting body, effectively like a borough, but just for this strip of water. And they have an enormous amount of power, but very little democratic oversight. So it's quite hard for me as a citizen of London to demand that our approach to the Thames changes, because who do I demand to? The mayor? Well, the mayor doesn't have any power over the Port of London Authority. My council? Neither do they. I can demand it to them, but like ultimately I can't vote them out of office, so why are they going to listen to me?
So we need a democratically elected mayor of the Thames.
I would either support making the Port of London Authority part of the Greater London Authority, that's like ultimately accountable through the mayor, or democratizing it in itself, like making it its own elected body, and maybe all the boroughs that border the Thames get a vote.
Yeah, it's kind of surprising that it's not part of the GLA, isn't it, and doesn't come under the mayoral authority.
Well, the Parliament has mucked around with London's government so much, with the LLC and then the GLC and then the abolition of that and now the establishment of the GLA. London has had a rough ride as a democracy, and that maybe explains some of its idiosyncrasies. We've also just had, the coalition government over David Cameron did all sorts of nutty things of like privatising things like the Canal and Rivers Trust, which used to be British Waterways, which was part of government, and now it's a private charity. So there's been sort of meddling from on high. So it's not all London's fault. But like in design terms, it's obvious. Like we just need to like, it's all about the threshold. It's all about like getting down into the Thames, not necessarily swimming in it. But
I always think of the way that Parisians interact with the Seine. And it's not really a fair comparison, considering the Thames is between 2 and 3 times wider than the Seine as it runs through Paris.
Well, it is in places, but like,
but it's very noticeable that they all go down like with a picnic hamper or a plastic bag full of alcohol and sit and chat, and there's benches and they can walk along, and there's loads of access points, and it's not muddy and smelly and covered in seagulls and and rotting boats and things.
Yeah, just like making it possible to interact with it, and like more ways down, making the ways that down that do exist feel good rather than feeling like slightly illegal or kind of very undercared for. There's lots of places further up the Thames that are quite charming, but are very privatized. Like the edge of the river is all kind of private property and very controlled. And then there's lots of places further down the river that where it gets really wide, that are pretty epic in their own right, but there's just no public infrastructure there. There's no kind of embankment or like pathways necessarily. It's a sort of it's just kind of abandoned industrial land, really. So I think there are some proper barriers in the way, but like there's a huge opportunity for London to kind of create a new relationship with our biggest public space. And you could imagine kind of fern-like structures reaching out into the Thames, floating things, more boats, making it cheaper and easier to get to use the Thames. I would make the Clippers as cheap as riding the bus. I think we should like use the fact that we have a really wide river running through our city as a transport route, make it less of this kind of weird spectacle. Also make better architecture alongside it. Like for so long, all the architecture... Well, Battersea Power Station is clearly cool, but like the stuff that they're building around Battersea Power Station is pretty grim. But if you think of like the Garden Bridge or the London Eye or the cable car down at near the Excel Centre, like there's for a long time been this idea that if you're building something next to the Thames, it has to be like big and wacky and silly and like a bit of a like tourist trap, rather than something like normal and sensible and useful for local people. There's some like mad stat of like how many children in London have never visited the Thames, and I can't remember.
There's not much to visit, really, is there? That's the trouble.
Well, exactly. Like, you can't really blame them, but like it's mind-boggling how many kids are like born in Camden and they get to 18 and they've never even visited the Thames, because they might have visited South London, but they do it on the tube, so they don't.
Well, maybe we need a Sen-style sort of lower platform level that runs the entire length.
Chris Romilly at Studio Occupy has been banging on about a floating swimming pool in the Thames, and it's a brilliant idea. You'd have a sort of ring of filter systems, which would be like plants and other systems, and then within that filter ring would be a swimming pool where you can go down. And I think it would be a really cool thing in its own right to have a swimming pool in the Thames. But what it would do would give people access to this river, and suddenly they'd feel a bit more ownership over it, like that sort of weird beach thing does in Paris. That like, because you have a way of getting down and experiencing it, suddenly it transforms your sense of ownership over the whole thing. Yeah,
and people love sitting next to the river for bars and pubs and things, don't they? Like on some parts of the Seine, they have the little dance areas and little sort of, I don't know, like trailers that's selling drinks and stuff, and you can go out and you can sit, or you can just go and enjoy it. Even though, like you say, you're not actually in the river. Yeah. You're not swimming in it or paddling in it, but yeah. Well, I think that covers a sufficient range of topics.
Phew. Thanks. No, that was fun. I hope I made some sense.
I think you did. And I look forward to seeing what Open House and Open City do in the coming months and years.
Me too. I mean, come to Open House in September. I think it's going to be a very different kind of festival to previous years. It has to evolve, but I think there's going to be a whole load of cool stuff using kind of traditional formats, opening up buildings and spaces and having some events in them, but also a whole load of alternative things that we're doing online. Completely rethought the book this year. I think this will be a highlight of the year, the kind of COVID year in architectural culture will be the Open House book, which is this extraordinary 33 essays by 33 different authors, edited by Owen Hatherley. That, I think that'll be something very special.
How much is that going to cost? 'Cause it's a bugbear of mine how expensive architecture books are.
I think it's £12.99.
Oh, well, that's distinctly affordable. So that's.
It is a bugbear. Like, so you get your sort of Peter Markley monograph, and it costs you £59.
I know.
Fuck is this?
I know. No, it's just particularly annoys me how expensive architecture books are.
Cheap and cheerful. That's the open house way.
So where can people find info on open house and all of that kind of thing?
Well, Open House is the festival. Open City is the organisation that runs Open House. So the website is open-city.org.uk. If you do want to buy that book, please do, because we have been very, very hard hit by the pandemic. You know, we're an events-led charity, and almost all of our income has evaporated. So we're in a very difficult spot as an institution, as a charity. We're very small, we're very nimble, but there's some things you just can't escape from, and one of them is a global pandemic. So every pre-order of the book helps us to weather our way through COVID. And we've also launched a Friends Appeal, where we're asking people to make small monthly donations to the charity, and there's some pretty cool rewards you can get in return for that. So yeah, open-city.org.uk.
Well, I think £12 is incredibly reasonable, so I would encourage everybody to go out and buy a copy of the book or pre-order a copy of the book. Phineas Harper, thank you very much.
Thank you.